Welcome to the 2022 Anzac address for the Department of General Surgery at Middlemore Hospital, a tradition in the department. As always, the 25th of April is a time to pause and reflect on the service and sacrifice of so many, perhaps reflecting that our current sacrifices for most have not been particularly large. We should look to the future but never forget the past and who earned our future for us. War was officially declared by the New Zealand government on the 5th of August 1914, and men in their thousands rapidly tried to enlist to serve in what was expected to be a short but nonetheless entertaining adventure. The reason we were able to accommodate such a rapid expansion in our armed forces was in no small measure due to our well-established territorial training system, perhaps best emphasised by the fact that only 10 days after the direct declaration of war we could dispatch a 1,500-strong expeditionary force to capture German Samoa and its wireless network. The wireless station had to be captured because it was part of a Pacific-wide ring of stations that allowed coordination of German naval activity, which left undisturbed would have been a threat not only to our troopships but also our commerce taking vital supplies through to England for the war effort on the Western Front. At the same time, the main body and first reinforcements of some 8,500 men were being prepared to sail, again likely for Europe. This expeditionary force, along with 3,800 horses, left New Zealand on the 16th of October. Throughout the war, some 100,000 New Zealanders were trained for service overseas, and around 60% went through the Featherston military camp, photographed here on the left, in the early days of the war. Not long after the start of the war, the tented accommodation was changed to huts, particularly as there had been outbreaks of various epidemics in other camps, including the Trentham military camp, subject to parliamentary inquiry. So advances were made in the care of our troops as they trained to go to war. Just as with the pandemic today, inoculations for certain diseases were compulsory for war service in 1914. And this photograph shows a number of men of the Wellington Infantry Battalion in Egypt who had declined to be inoculated for cholera. They are being dispatched back home, and one can only imagine what their more senior colleague is saying to them as he wishes them a safe trip. To be fair, having been named in the media and no doubt shamed for their decision, most of the men who were returned, and it wasn't many, did ultimately accept inoculation and went on to serve in the war. What became known as Anzac was occupied by the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps for around 8 months. It was never particularly much bigger than 700 acres in dimension, and it was an area of misery. Questionable tactics such as the Royal Navy alone trying to storm the Dardanelles, the tough terrain, a determined enemy, and the ever-present threat of life-threatening diseases all made life at Anzac almost impossible. Care of the wounded was challenging and supply issues were enormous. The landing at Anzac was incredibly complex, and this diagram, courtesy of the University of New South Wales, simply shows how the peninsula probably appeared on the first day. The vegetation, however, would be stripped away very rapidly. The object eventually, or overwhelmingly, was to capture the heights to the top left, Baby 700 leading up to Chunnock Bear and then Hill 971, from which point the Dardanelles and their defences on the eastern side of the peninsula could be captured. The geography of this is just horrendous, as can be appreciated. On the first day, the New Zealanders were tasked with supporting the Australians who had landed first and been tasked with pushing as far inland and as high as possible. However, what was achieved on the first day in terms of the vertical extension really is how it remained for the duration of the campaign, with the exception of the capture of Chunnock Bear, albeit briefly, in August of 1915. Expansion was made to the left of Walker's Ridge and to the right of Lone Pine down onto the beach, but overall only about 700 acres was ever in Anzac hands. Getting off the beach was tough because to stay there was to invite death from the well-sighted Turkish artillery and, of course, the tough Turkish defenders. Being wounded at Gallipoli was not a pleasant experience because one had to be evacuated from the beach, and this photograph shows both walking wounded and stretcher cases being towed out by a lighter for loading onto a larger ship which could offer some rudimentary care whilst being transported back to Egypt some 800 miles away. A number of initiatives existed at Anzac, including air support, trying to spot for the Royal Naval gunfire to destroy Turkish batteries. Hamilton had marine telephone cables laid between his headquarters and those at Anzac and the British and French forces at Helles. There were advances in water transport and purification, as all water had to be brought into the peninsula, and there were deception and self-firing rifle techniques developed as evacuation became more obvious. These photographs show some of the water transport facilities. On the right, smaller vessels on wheels up in some of the numerous gullies, and on the left, a massive water tank being dragged up the area of Walker's Ridge to allow for better distribution. While some football was played on the island of Lemnos by, in this game, arriving Australian naval troops and Australian infantry troops, the cricket match on our left at Shell Green, which is down the coast from Anzac, was deliberately designed to fool the Turks into believing that the Anzacs were staying. However, we weren't, and this shows William Scurry, the inventor of the self-firing rifle, allowing men to leave many rifles in position during the evacuation from Gallipoli, only to have them fire when the men were a long way away. Water dripped through from the canister at the top, and as it filled the canister at the bottom, eventually the force would transfer and the trigger would be fired. Scurry was decorated for this invention and later in the war won the Military Cross, having been commissioned in France. But by December it was clear the invasion had failed, and over 5 nights some 36,000 men were evacuated from Anzac without loss, and in early January 1916 similar evacuation was undertaken of the British forces at the south of the peninsula. All who left expressed considerable sadness, if not embarrassment, at leaving their mates behind to forever rest in the Dardanelles. Following Gallipoli, most of our attention turned to the Western Front. This was, of course, the scene of terrible losses, with over 12,000 New Zealanders losing their life over 2 years of fighting for our division on the front. But ultimately, this is where the war was won. We can be very proud that the New Zealand division remained the most complete division of any Allied nation, and this was in no small way due to the superb organisation which saw over 100,000 men trained and dispatched in just 4 years. We introduced far better food services such as the New Zealand Field Bakery and Field Butchery services, and unlike Gallipoli, it was possible to establish hygiene services. At Gallipoli, the only way to cleanse oneself was to take a bath in the ocean, of course still at the risk of being hit by Turkish fire. We introduced laundry and bathing services and delousing stations. Pay records, employment, education and graves registration were all significant improvements on the Western Front, and of course there were changes in how fighting was conducted itself. This photograph is of hot food being created by the New Zealand Army Service Corps on the Western Front, and whilst today occupational health and safety might have something to say about the use of the axe, it does demonstrate the importance of warm food, something that was really not possible on any significant scale at Gallipoli. This photograph is taken from the Field Bakery War Diary for the month of March of the NZEF on the Western Front, and gives some idea of the colossal output of bread. Indeed, in March, some 380,000 kilograms of bread was baked, and on many days, this was enough to feed over 32,000 men. And unlike Gallipoli, for the fighting men on the Western Front, malnutrition was not the enemy it had been on the peninsula. That is not to say prisoners of war had it easy, though, and there are numerous accounts of how tough it was to be a POW on the Western Front. Around 500 New Zealanders were captured in the First World War. Under 30 of those were on Gallipoli, the vast majority on the Western Front. A small number were captured in the desert. The scale of this was enough that a war prisoner department was set up in London for the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, and this photograph is of one such New Zealand serviceman who was captured, Private Henry J. Poole of the Canterbury Battalion. In fact, he'd been reported killed in action on the Somme. His name had appeared in the Roll of Honour in the daily newspapers in New Zealand, and his family had been notified. But about 6 or 7 weeks after that notification, he was found to actually be in a German prison hospital. He had been shot through the chest and suffered quite grievous wounds, and it's quite extraordinary that he survived. Henry Poole went on to return to New Zealand and died in the early 1950s. At the end of the war, considerable support was given to aid men to return to what was hoped to be more of a normal civilian life. Education and training opportunities were given, with training particularly in horticulture, agriculture and farming techniques. Welfare and war pension services were constructed and lasted for at least a decade. Specific care needs were developed at a number of hospitals, and in particular orthopaedic care at Rotorua Hospital was significantly advanced, along with care of psychologically traumatised soldiers at Hanmer Springs. And of course they had a hope for a lasting peace. But just 20 years later, these men and others were to destroy that hope. Can all undoubtedly appreciate the evil of Adolf Hitler, seen next to Rudolf Hess on the top left. The second photograph is of Reinhold Heydrich, who was known as the Butcher of Prague, an evil member of the SS and one of the architects of what was, of course, referred to as the final solution to the Jewish question. He died of a pulmonary embolus some days after what was initially felt to have been a failed assassination attempt, and whilst we should celebrate his death, unfortunately, when the plotters were captured, Hitler had their home villages destroyed, with the death of several thousand men, women and children. The war in the Pacific must not be forgotten. Emperor Hirohito was perhaps lucky to escape execution as a war criminal. The fate, however, was not avoided by his senior commander, Tojo. So on the 25th of April, let's reflect on the cost to New Zealand of 2 world wars. In excess of 300,000 New Zealanders served overseas, and over 34,000 New Zealanders lost their lives in the combination of the First and Second World War. A further 75,000 were injured and 8,800 captured, the vast majority in World War II. Of course, it's likely that most, if not all, of these service personnel were in some way affected by their war service. And even today, we're aware of the scars caused by conflict. We should reflect that New Zealand had the second highest casualty rate amongst service personnel in the Great War, second only by a decimal point or so to our Australian cousins. And we had the highest casualty rates of all nations in the Second World War. We must never forget their sacrifice, lest we forget.